All right. Well, welcome everybody. Happy Friday to everybody. I'm very happy you can join us today. My name is Adil. I'll be one of the moderators for this webinar today. Um, we have taken a bit of a break ever since our last conference, so we're hoping to kick off our webinar, and we have a very, very unique, different, and exciting one for today. And we're working hard, the webinar team, to get more webinars out for you up in the coming months. So please take a look out for those. Couple of additional high-level comments just with respect to previous webinars. You can always check out our YouTube channel. This webinar, along with our previous ones that were free of charge, are listed on the YouTube channel. Any ones that were not, they're actually on the CMBS store. So please look out for that. I would like to take this opportunity to, I'm just going to share my screen to introduce our next year's conference. Our next year's conference, as my screen pops up, will be in Fredericton, New Brunswick. Can you see my screen? I need a oh, perfect. Thank you. So it's in Fredericton, and our sort of theme is innovations in health, improving patient outcomes through sustainable design and appropriate adoption. Our conference planning team is actually currently being assembled, and if you are interested in volunteering your time for this, really the premium event for biomedical engineers, clinical engineers in Canada, please do reach out. I think more the merrier. We had a great turnout in Toronto last year, and we want to continue that great turnout and success in Fredericton, May 27th to 29th in 2025. All right. Sorry, I am just getting a bit organized. So really, this specific webinar that we're talking about will delve into the critical importance of cultural safety in biomedical engineering. Drawing from a research project conducted within the Lower Mainland Biomedical Engineering in Vancouver, the LMBME, this session will share key findings about the research, outline the steps LMBME is taking to embed cultural humility and safety into our department and services, and offer practical recommendations for other biomedical engineering teams looking to do the same. So whether you're just beginning this journey to explore cultural safety, or you're looking to enhance your existing practices, this webinar will provide valuable guidance and actionable steps to support your journey. And along with that, I will ask Michael to actually introduce our expert guest speaker. Michael.
Oh, thanks, Adil. My name is Michael Barton. I'm coming to you from Halifax, which is the modern name for Kipuktuk. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional unceded lands of Mi'kmaq here on a very rainy day as Hurricane Isaac kind of swipes by us offshore. Really looking forward to this talk. I will actually have to watch it on recording because I have a design meeting which is scheduled exactly in the same time slot. So I wanted to wear my orange today, and if you don't wear your orange today, I encourage you to wear it on Monday, which is Truth and Reconciliation Day across the country. And our talk today is wonderfully timed with exactly that. There's so many different concepts that really we're learning, even though they've been truths that have been kind of not necessarily as obvious as they should have been over the entire age of our country. So I personally am really glad that, although very tough, we are actually in an age of enlightenment and we can actually do something about it. So Brendan today is going to facilitate for us some concepts that we can incorporate into our everyday working lives, which is fantastic. I've actually had the pleasure of working with Brendan a little bit over, Brendan, what, like about 7, maybe even pushing 10 years now? For a little while.
7, 8 years or so.
Yeah, he and I've been on a couple of different committees, a couple of different initiatives across Canada. Really enjoy working with him. Pleasure working with him a little bit with the conference in Vancouver, for instance. Lots of mad respect, coast to coast, my coast to his coast. and really looking forward to hearing your talk today. Couple of housekeeping items. Normally, I would kind of watch the Q&A. Adil will have to grab the reins for today. So when you type in your questions, type them in the Q&A, not the chat. We'll monitor that, answer your questions at the very, very end. And housekeeping, we already talked about the next conference. Brendan and Adil, I think that covers everything for today, correct? I
I
took
think so.
actually about
Yep.
a minute or two, even more than I meant to. So we try and keep our little intros as short as possible to give most time to the speakers. So without further ado, Brendan, floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you for the kind introduction, Michael. So I'm just going to get my screen set up here. So, screen 2. And then I'll swap that. Okay, would someone mind just confirming that you can see my slides now?
Confirmed. And
Great.
we're good.
Okay. Yeah, so thanks again for joining, everybody. Again, my name is Brendan, and I work with Lower Mainland Biomedical Engineering in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia. And so today I'm going to be chatting with you all about a research project that I conducted surrounding the cultural safety within our department's service provision. And I'm also going to try to make some broader recommendations to what I think this research can mean for other biomedical engineering organizations. So I just wanted to start off with a land acknowledgement. So I'm joining today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, which include the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So the colonial name of the location I'm calling in from is Vancouver, BC. Recognizing that's a virtual call, I'd invite all of you to take a moment to reflect on the Indigenous peoples whose lands you are on today. So for those of you that have visited Vancouver before and explored around Stanley Park, you might recognize this photo here that I'm sharing on the slide. And so this is of the seawall surrounding Stanley Park, and you can see Siwash Rock right there visible in the center. And so as I was working my research project, I did most of my deep thinking and reflection during runs along the seawall. And that was particularly meaningful to me because the stunning landscapes of Vancouver and the surrounding region were what initially drew me to want to live here. And it's ultimately why I moved here. And so it just reminded me of how humbled and grateful I am to be a settler on these lands. So I took this photo towards the end of my research journey and felt it was meaningful to share with all of you today. Just very briefly in terms of the agenda. So I'm going to start just with a bit of background context on our department. Then I'll focus on the research project for the majority of the presentation. Speak a little bit about the motivation behind the project, the overall orientation to the project, as well as the inquiry questions that I was looking to answer, the design and approach. Then I'll move into the findings, conclusions, and recommendations that were internally targeted to our department. And then I'll briefly touch on some limitations of the research. And then I'll close off the presentation with some broader recommendations that are external and I think can be generalized to any biomedical engineering organization. I did just want to note, I will be discussing cultural humility and safety within biomedical services. And so I've done a lot of research on the topic, but I'm certainly not an expert in cultural humility and safety. So I might not cover everything perfectly. I might make some mistakes. I'm just looking to foster some discussion today and learn together alongside all of you. So just as we're starting out, I also wanted to locate myself just to be transparent about the context of where I'm coming from and how my perspectives have been informed. So for those of you that aren't familiar, the image that I'm showing here is called the Wheel of Privilege, and it serves as a visual tool for understanding and reflecting on how different aspects of identity intersect and lead to our experiences in society. So the closer you are to the center across the different aspects of identity, the more power and privilege that you have. So as an example, one of the aspects is housing, with the outer ring showing homelessness, moving to shelter to renting, and then in the center, moving to property ownership. Another aspect is indigeneity. So colonizers are in the central position and Indigenous peoples without access to their communities are on the outer position. And so I've circled where I'm located here in the blue, and you can see that I'm mostly near the center. So I have significant power and significant unearned privilege. And so that's not a bad thing. It's not something to feel shame about, but what's helpful in terms of this tool is it supports that awareness and understanding, and particularly in the context of how my experiences and perspectives differ from those of marginalized group, and then how that might impact interactions. It's also important context that I wanted to share because it was ultimately one of the key motivators for this project that I conducted, in that with that significant power and unearned privilege, I feel that responsibility to use that to contribute towards positive social change and advocate for those that are marginalized. So just a bit of background on our department. So Lower Mainland Biomedical Engineering, we support biomedical equipment for 4 health authorities, with the majority of our supported sites in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia. So both Provincial Health Services Authority as well as First Nations Health Authority have provincial scope. So we support their operational sites that fall within the geographic responsibility of the Lower Mainland Health Authorities, while the PHSA and FNHA sites that fall outside of our geographic region are supported by other biomed departments. So within BC, we have Lower Mainland Biomedical Engineering, Northern Health Biomedical Engineering, Interior Biomedical Engineering, and Vancouver Island Biomedical Engineering. So just looking at this image that I'm displaying here, our department supports sites that fall within the orange and green regions. So my specific area of responsibility is for Vancouver Coastal Health, as well as Providence Healthcare Operations, as well as our department support for First Nations Health Authority. So FNHA is a very unique health authority, and it serves as a health and wellness partner to over 200 diverse First Nations communities and citizens across British Columbia. So they deliver primary healthcare services through more than 130 medical health centers and nursing stations across the province. And to my awareness, it's the only province-wide health authority of its kind in the country. In terms of our department, we have about 180 technologists, 7 clinical engineers that make up a regional team, and 16 management staff. We support 112,000 devices with a total capital value of about $1.1 billion. So just a little bit more on our department's support for FNHA. So our support began back in November 22, and the effort was a collaboration between our department as well as Northern and Interior Biomedical Engineering alongside FNHA. So again, each of our biomedical departments is responsible for supporting FNHA sites that fall within our geographic scope of responsibility. So for our department, we support 3 sites, Kitasoo Nursing Station near Clem2, BC. And so that's just up in the left-hand corner of the image. We also support New Hawk Health Centre near Bella Bella, BC. And then lastly, a simulation lab that's located near the Deep Cove on the North Shore of Vancouver. So the majority of FNHA sites actually reside within the northern and interior regions of BC. So again, those departments have a larger department or a larger scope of sites that they support. In terms of the medical equipment inventory, it's mostly primary equipment, so items such as AEDs, vital signs monitors, oxygen concentrators, suctions, some infusion pumps. And for our department's specific support, our Coastal Biomedical Operations team supports the FNHA sites. So the team is responsible for supporting the Vancouver Coastal Health Coastal Community of Care. And so that includes sites along the Sunshine Coast and the Sea to Sky Highway, as well as the more northern regions of Bella Bella and Bella Coola. The team has 1 supervisor, a senior technologist, and 4 frontline techs that are based out of Lionsgate Hospital, which is located on the North Shore of Vancouver. And then the team also has 3 technologists who are based out of Sechelt, Squamish, and Cathet. In terms of what our support looks like, it involves an annual visit to the FNHA sites to perform preventative maintenance, and the rest of the support is managed remotely through shipping and receiving via courier services. We provide a full scope of services, and so that includes support for technology selection and risk management activities. So in terms of our department's initial efforts for fostering cultural humility and safety, we focused on our coastal biomedical team, which included support to complete cultural humility and safety training, answering any questions or concerns that the team had in terms of their support to FNHA, and also facilitating introductions with the local staff that they'd be working with and delivering services to. So I've been working on my Master's of Arts in Leadership that's specific to healthcare. And so the program overall focuses on developing self-awareness and capacity as a leader. And again, it's specific to the healthcare environment. And so as part of the program, an engaged leadership project's required, and that involves collaboration with others around an issue or an opportunity that's meaningful to the group of people, as well as to myself, and leads towards positive change. And so that's where I chose to focus on cultural humility and safety within biomed service delivery. And I'll speak a little bit more around the project motivation in the coming slides. So now I'm going to move into my research project, and I just want to start quite wide and then build into the foundations and the specific context of my project. So what is truth and reconciliation? So ultimately, it's a process aimed at addressing and healing from historical injustices. So reconciliation in Canada's context is an Indigenous specific goal, and it's aimed to address specific injustices that have been experienced by Indigenous peoples within Canada, which includes forced assimilation as well as genocide. So truth involves identifying hidden or ignored histories with the aim to provide an accurate account of past injustices. So for example, taking steps to understand the truth of Canada's residential school system. And then reconciliation focuses on taking action to redress harms caused by colonization and work towards mutual understanding and respect. So reconciliation can't occur without first addressing the truth, as understanding and acknowledging past injustices is essential for healing and accountability and providing that foundation for action. So what's the truth regarding the safety and effectiveness of the healthcare system for Indigenous peoples in BC? So going back to 2020, the In Plain Sight report was commissioned, and that was in response to reports of racism against Indigenous peoples within the emergency room environment at various hospitals in BC. So the report was published, and it ultimately identified systemic racism, stereotyping, and discrimination against Indigenous peoples within the BC healthcare system. As a result, Indigenous peoples in BC receive lower quality care, and in some cases experience preventable fatal outcomes. There's a couple of facts within the report that really stood out to me and gave me pause. And so only 16% of Indigenous people surveyed reported not experiencing discrimination in BC. And additionally, 35% of healthcare workers reported witnessing discrimination against Indigenous peoples. So consequently, there's significant mistrust and avoidance of the healthcare system among Indigenous peoples within the province. And so, you know, contrasting that with my own experience, I've accessed healthcare services within BC many times since moving here. I've never questioned the quality of care. I've never felt unsafe. It's not even something that would cross my mind. So ultimately, the report calls upon the BC government as well as our healthcare system in collaboration with Indigenous peoples to address the legacy of colonialism and enhance accountability for instances of Indigenous specific racism. So in addition to the call to action from the In Plain Sight report, there's also legislative mandates that exist within BC to affirm and protect the rights of Indigenous peoples. So within BC, we have the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, and that adopts UNDRIP into law. And ultimately, that creates a legislative imperative for action to be taken to affirm and protect Indigenous peoples' rights, which includes the right to access health services that are delivered in a culturally safe manner. In addition to those legislative mandates, the regional health authorities that we serve and that we're all part of have internal mandates for embedding cultural humility and safety into their work environment, as well as their services, and our department's subject to those internal mandates. So although I might have personal perspectives in terms of thinking that this work is critical and the ethical thing to do, others might have other perspectives. ultimately the work is not an optional thing to do. We don't have a choice, we have to do it. We are mandated to do it. So to kind of summarize the motivation behind the project, going back to the intro there, the responsibility to use the privilege that I have, the truth of the BC healthcare system and the call to action, as well as the mandates that we have to act. The other piece that I found interesting was when I reviewed the literature surrounding cultural humility and safety. I noticed that there was an absence of literature that was specific to the context that we work in within the system. So the majority of literature focused on patient interfacing services, so between the caregiver and the patient, whereas we are delivering services primarily to the caregiver. And so I was looking to explore how that might look different in our context. So I've been talking a lot about cultural safety and humility, and I haven't described what it is. So First Nations Health Authority created this nice visual, which it's a bit busy for a slide, but it does a really great job at tying together the concepts of cultural humility, safety, as well as reconciliation. So if you have some time afterwards, I'd encourage you to look a bit closer at this. Ultimately, for cultural safety, it aims to create a respectful and safe environment for service recipients of all cultures by reducing power imbalances and emphasizing others' values and needs. So historically, dominant groups have held more power in the forms of authority, control, and influence when compared to marginalized groups, and cultural safety aims to create that environment where those power differentials are identified and mitigated. So importantly, cultural safety is an outcome for which the service recipient determines if an interaction is safe. So safety can never be guaranteed, but the overall goal is to maximize safe interactions and to minimize unsafe interactions. An analogy that I've kind of used to help think through this is similar to our support for medical devices. We can do a lot of things to enable safety, but we can never guarantee absolute safety of a device. And so throughout this presentation, I'm using the language of culturally safe biomedical services, just for simplicity's sake, but I just wanted to note that we can never guarantee the safety of our services. Cultural humility, on the other hand, is a critical enabling factor for cultural safety. So humility involves that ongoing self-reflection and learning by individuals to be aware of their beliefs, biases, power, and privilege, and to be open to others' perspectives. So I like to think of it as a way of being, and the first step towards cultural safety begins with that individual commitment towards cultural humility. So to contrast the two different concepts, safety is about creating the systems in the environment free from discrimination and emphasizing respect, while humility is personal and related to exploring and challenging inwards perspectives while also be opening to other perspectives. Ultimately, both concepts aim to promote a system that's characterized by mutual respect, kindness, common understanding, and a balanced power dynamic between service providers and recipients. So now moving into the project orientation and inquiry questions. So due to the sensitive and challenging nature of discussions surrounding cultural safety, I chose to take an appreciative orientation to my project, which is a strengths-based approach that focuses on identifying and building upon what's already working well, rather than fixing problems or addressing deficits. Also knowing that cultural safety can never be guaranteed and acknowledging that that first step towards cultural safety begins with an individual commitment towards humility, I oriented my overall research design to identify the conditions necessary for developing humility among our department staff, thus contributing towards that overall journey towards cultural safety. So my overarching question that I was looking to answer was, how might our department create the conditions to provide culturally safe services? And to guide that, I had 4 sub-questions. So the first was, how is cultural humility currently being practiced within our department? What are the characteristics of culturally safe biomedical services? What opportunities exist for fostering cultural humility among our staff? And then lastly, what specific steps do we need to take to create the conditions to develop cultural humility among our staff? In terms of my study design, it involved 3 cycles of engagement. So the first cycle involved an interview with a First Nations Health Authority cultural humility and safety expert, and I conducted that interview. Following that, the second cycle involved members of our frontline team that supports FNHA. So again, that coastal community of care team. Since that team ultimately reports up to myself, I had a power over relationship. So I had a third party conduct that engagement to minimize any undue pressure or influence that the team members might have felt during their participation. That specific cycle involved an individual interview between the facilitator and the team supervisor, and then also a group method, which involved frontline staff. And in terms of that method, there was a series of questions that were asked to the frontline staff, time for individual reflection, and then group discussion. So in the context of that engagement cycle, the facilitator captured key points, ideas, and perspectives during the discussion, and then provided those to myself afterwards. The very last engagement cycle involved an interview that, again, I conducted with a member of our management team. So for data analysis, so the data that was collected was in the form of transcripts from the interviews and that written summary from the group method. And so coming from an engineering background, I'm used to working with numbers, but in this case, the analysis was solely qualitative. And so that for me was quite challenging, but also a very interesting and rewarding experience. So in terms of how I approached that analysis, I began with coding. And so that involves systematically identifying and labeling key pieces of information within the transcripts in the group method summary, such as words, phrases, or patterns, based on their relevance to the overall research questions. Based upon those codes, I then developed themes, and those were identified by looking at broader patterns and concepts that arose from grouped codes and represented overarching ideas or insights that helped to explain the data. So this was an iterative process. It involved multiple rounds of coding and then refinement to ultimately develop some meaningful themes within the data. Based upon the themes, findings were then developed. So findings are factual observations of the data that again relate back to the original research questions. Conclusions then make meaning of the factual findings, and that involves interpreting the data. So the conclusions are the interpretations of the factual findings. And then very lastly, recommendations are based on the findings and conclusions. So as the researcher, my role within this analysis was to be as objective as possible and to describe why I was making certain interpretations. So to enhance my awareness and transparency of my interpretations, I practice reflexivity throughout, which basically involves continuously reflecting on why I was interpreting the data in specific ways, and also acknowledging how my perspectives were shaping the outcomes. So the ultimate synthesis of the information was informed by participant perspectives, peer-reviewed literature, regulations and mandates, and I also had a cultural safety and humility expert support that process as well. And that was a separate cultural safety and humility expert to the individual that I interviewed from FNHA. So now moving into what I found. So I had 4 key findings, and I was just planning to mention a couple of them briefly on this slide, and then dig a bit deeper into the last 2. So the first finding was that participants identified key characteristics for culturally safe biomedical engineering service and what's required to enable them. It is important to note that there was no Indigenous perspective captured within the context of this project, so there is a significant limitation within that finding. For the second finding, participants recognize that cultural humility among service providers is a critical enabler for culturally safe biomedical engineering service provision, and they shared factors from their perspective that can either foster or inhibit cultural humility among staff. I'll talk a little bit more about those 2 findings in some subsequent slides that relate to conclusions. But digging a bit further into the last 2 findings. So the third finding was that our staff are demonstrating values and behaviors that are associated with cultural humility, and they're at varying stages in their journeys. So Most staff recognize that cultural humility is an ongoing journey rather than a checklist, and emphasize flexibility, respect, and strong communications with Indigenous clients. And they viewed cultural safety as a mindset shift rather than a specific action. There was also broad willingness among all participants to learn and grow. There was one perspective that was shared that demonstrated an earlier understanding of cultural humility, with that specific individual stating that they weren't part of the problem, and they felt that there was no specific problem within our department with respect to cultural safety that needed to be addressed. So that was response was characteristic of what's termed as white fragility. And so white fragility is a concept that describes defensive and uncomfortable reactions often exhibited by white individuals when discussing racism. So those reactions often stem from white people's perceptions of themselves as raceless and in relation to the superior position that white people hold in the racial hierarchy. And so that can make it difficult for white people to recognize and engage in conversations surrounding racial dynamics. So as part of this project, I read a book called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And for myself, it was super eye-opening, really impactful, and I'd highly suggest reviewing it if you have the opportunity. So again, the ultimate impact of white fragility is avoiding or minimizing discussions about racial dynamics, and that can lead to the perpetuation of racism. So for the fourth finding, so the level of commitment and shared accountability for embedding cultural safety in our department's services was strong among most participants. So most of the participants agreed on the importance of embedding cultural humility and safety across all service areas of our department, recognizing its critical role in supporting Indigenous clients and ensuring a safe workplace for Indigenous staff, as well as contributing to overall systemic change. However, there were differing views, with one individual questioning the relevance of cultural safety for teams not directly interacting with known Indigenous clients and perceiving it as less critical. So this finding reflected a bit of a divide between those that see cultural safety as a collective responsibility and those that were viewing it more from an individual perspectives, and again, sometimes showing evidence of white fragility. So now moving into conclusions. And so again, these are the interpretations of the factual findings. And there were 4 key conclusions identified. So I'm going to skip over the first 3 here, which I'm going to go into greater detail in the coming slides. But I just wanted to mention that one of the conclusions was that specific supports are needed now for teams delivering services to our known Indigenous clients. And so that was based upon some feedback that came forward and improvement opportunities that were identified for our existing support. But diving into the first conclusion here, so the first conclusion was that the characteristics and conditions necessary for providing culturally safe service for patients extend to culturally safe biomedical engineering service provision. And so that might seem obvious, but again, there was no specific guidance that I identified within the literature to the interface for which we work within the public healthcare sector. So looking at this visual here, the bottom part of the slide, we start on the left-hand side. The key characteristics of culturally safe biomedical service provision were identified through the research project. And so similar to cultural safety in the patient's context, in our context, the service recipient determines if services are safe, and we can't guarantee that as the provider. As part of the research process, I developed a starting point of what characteristics for culturally safe biomedical service provision look like. And those characteristics were informed both by the literature as well as participants' perspectives. So some of the key characteristics included emphasizing relationship building, open communication, respecting autonomy, being flexible to adapt to the needs and preferences of clients, and showing up in a humble way. Again, it might seem obvious, but this wasn't explicit in the literature. I do want to note again, there was no Indigenous perspective captured within the context of this research. And so this is intended as a starting point to help support conversations, but we do need to hear directly from our clients on what cultural safety means to them. Moving to the center of this visual here. So I've summarized 3 key enabling conditions that came forward as supporting culturally safe biomedical service provision. So the first piece was cultural humility. So again, humility among the service provider must be in place to enable safe services. A second condition that's required to be present is the presence of strong relationships with clients, which are essential for trust, building trust and mutual understanding. So those relationships build that foundation for understanding the important values and preferences from the perspective of the service recipient. Lastly, organizational support. So organizational support is necessary for supporting staff development, support that relationship building, and providing services in a safe way. So that could mean creating some extra capacity for frontline staff to complete the training, spend time needed to thoroughly communicate, and build relationships with clients. Moving over to the right-hand side, there were 4 key points that were identified to support the development of cultural humility among staff. So the first and probably most obvious is training. So ongoing training for all staff was recognized as essential for fostering cultural humility. But there was some mixed feedback on the actual effectiveness of training. So some participants expressed that they felt that it was a good starting point, but others highlighted that experiences and relationships were more effective for cultivating humility. So on the topic of experiences, participants shared that real-life interactions with Indigenous peoples significantly enhance cultural humility skills. There were some personal stories that were shared, and those stories illustrated the value of experiential learning, leading to recommendations for experiences such as engaging in local Indigenous events and providing more opportunities for staff to deliver services to Indigenous clients. On the topic of relationships, so safe, accountable relationships came forward as holding significant value as they allow for vulnerable conversations in an environment where perspectives could be safely explored. And it was conveyed that co-learning relationships facilitated a safe space for reflective feedback as well as accountability. And then very lastly, organizational champions. So the role of organizational champions emerged as important, with leaders holding that responsibility to model culturally humble values and behaviors and set that example for staff to follow, and then also to provide that mentorship to help guide staff on their cultural humility journeys. So now moving into the second conclusion. So the second conclusion was that action is required for our department to fully meet our directives for embedding cultural humility and safety in our services. So going back to the background, I mentioned that we have both external as well as internal mandates to ensure that cultural humility and safety is embedded both within our department and our services. And so we'd initially targeted our team supporting First Nations Health Authority, which was a great initial step. But the findings from this research showed that we have further work to do. So again, it emerged that some participants had an earlier understanding of cultural humility and safety, and that evidence of white fragility was present in one participant's responses. There was also improvement opportunities that were identified in our services for existing Indigenous clients, such as strengthening relationships and ensuring that pathways are present for open and transparent feedback on the safety of our service. There was also a lack of consensus on the relevance of cultural safety and humility to all areas of our department, which demonstrated that not all participants view the existing situation regarding healthcare outcomes for Indigenous peoples in BC as a systemic problem. So speaking a bit more on that systems piece, this slide is probably one of the most important from the presentation. So if you take something away, maybe focus on this one here. So you can see here there's a picture of an iceberg. And so the iceberg model can help illustrate how Indigenous specific racism is a systems level problem. So we know that Indigenous specific racism is a systems level problem because the healthcare system within BC is currently producing unacceptably poor results for the Indigenous population relative to the rest of the population. We also know that Indigenous people interact with every part of the system, so they access services. They're also staff within the overall system working alongside us. So looking at the iceberg, at the very top, what's visible is the events. That's what's actually happening, and it's well evidenced and documented that unacceptable events are happening. Directly beneath the surface, so what's hidden are the patterns and trends. And so those patterns and trends normalize the events that are happening today. An example there could be the stereotype that Indigenous peoples are violent or aggressive. Below that are the underlying structures, so the systems, processes that influence the patterns and those trends. An example there with respect to biomedical engineering could be under-resourcing biomed services that support remote areas where Indigenous peoples reside. But at the very bottom, and most importantly, is the individual mental models. So mental models are deeply ingrained assumptions, generalizations, and images which shape the way that we see the world and how we act. So we all have mental models. We're often not aware of what they look like, and it takes work and effort to look inwards to identify those and critically examine them. So the biases, assumptions, and awareness of how each of us view Indigenous peoples, whether those are conscious or unconscious, ultimately influence our actions. And those actions then shape those underlying structures, patterns, and trends within the system, and that in the end leads to those observable outcomes and events. So if we're aiming to ensure that those events are safe, we need to start by focusing at that very bottom level on individuals' mental models, and we can't isolate any part of the overall system from its responsibility for contributing towards change. So whether or not we know that we're interacting with Indigenous peoples, our mental models are going to play that crucial role in terms of how we perceive, how we respond to, and how we engage with others. And so in situations where we are engaged with Indigenous peoples, our ability to challenge our own biases, recognize those power dynamics, and demonstrate humility is critical for creating that genuinely safe and respectful environment. And so cultural humility at the end of the day is about understanding and challenging those mental models with the aim of fostering safe interactions. So tying that back to the finding where one participant felt that there was no issue with respect to cultural humility and safety in our department, and it should only be prioritized for areas serving known Indigenous clients. The absence of perceived issues doesn't mean that systemic problems aren't existent, and it highlights that opportunity to cultivate a broader systems level perspective and understanding of cultural humility and safety among our staff, and to build that shared commitment and accountability towards working towards those objectives. In addition to that, the focus on cultural humility within our department will help foster resilience and develop skills that are applicable to all areas of biomedical engineering service provision. So conclusion three was that to effectively embed cultural humility and safety into our department services, we need to have a collective approach. So it's very well documented in the literature that addressing complex systems problems such as reconciliation and systemic racism requires a unified commitment and accountability from all stakeholders. So without that unity, without that commitment, progress can be impeded, and it can often lead to a fragmented approach, inefficiency, differing views on prioritization, and a lack of effectiveness when working towards solutions. So again, the findings from my research highlighted varying commitments or levels of commitment among participants, which could impede progress. So to foster shared accountability as well as commitment, the literature suggests that a collective approach can be beneficial where teams engage in discussions to understand diverse perspectives and to enhance awareness of system dynamics. So particularly for problems involving social justice, a collective approach is evidence to be effective for building that collective support and accountability. In addition to that, what I found through the research was that most participants in this study appear to be pursuing their cultural humility journeys independently, and the literature has shown that cultural humility has grows through connection and relationships. So by taking next steps as a team rather than individually, there's an opportunity to strengthen individual commitment towards cultural humility while also building that cohesive organizational-wide commitment necessary for embedding cultural humility and safety across all of our services. And so, we do most of our work as a team, and there's no reason for this to be an exception. So now moving to the internal recommendation. So I'm going to dig into the first recommendation a bit more deeply, but just briefly, internally, recommendations that came through the research were to strengthen relationships with our existing Indigenous clients, to provide immediate support to our team that's delivering services to our existing Indigenous clients, and to share learnings and recommendations with service providers who support healthcare caregivers. So that's what I'm doing today. But digging a little bit further into recommendation 1. So recommendation 1 is that our department needs to prioritize actions to embed cultural humility and safety across all areas of the department. So I've recommended a collaborative approach, and drawing from conclusion 3, working collaboratively as a department should help develop that shared commitment and accountability, as well as a systems perspective of cultural humility and safety in biomedical service provision. Through the research, the characteristics and enabling conditions for embedding cultural humility and safety within the department and the services will help inform the work. And again, that overall emphasis should be on fostering cultural humility among all of our staff. With the objectives being developed and the plan for achieving those objectives, we'll then need to implement and monitor, including seeking feedback on the safety of our services from our clients. So the good news is this recommendation is being carried out. Our department actually just renewed our strategic plan, and we're prioritizing this work as one of our key goals over the next 3 years. And so the graphic at the bottom here just summarizes that overall goal. Briefly, there were some limitations with the research, so not all of our staff were included, so the observations from the participants can't be generalized to the entire organization. And again, only frontline staff who support First Nations Health Authority were included, so perspectives from other teams are unknown. Additionally, the perspectives of Indigenous clients were not included. And so within the context of this research, the First Nations Health Authority Cultural Safety and Humility expert, their perspectives were used to represent their clients' views, but it's acknowledged that the needs regarding safety and preferences are determined by the service recipient. And so it's extremely important that we collect that feedback and input from our Indigenous clients. So preparing for this presentation, I was thinking, okay, well, we have these internal recommendations, but what does this research mean more broadly, and what can I do to help share some practical recommendations with the broader biomedical community? So I think the reality and the context is going to look different for everybody, but I do think the learnings and recommendations that I share today do have broader value. So the first piece that came to mind is that individual commitment towards cultural humility. Again, going back to that First Nations Health Authority graphic, you can see here circled in yellow, the most prominent item in this graphic is, "It starts with me." And so there's a nice quote from the former Chief Medical Officer of FNHA who described this, and I'm just going to read it here. And so they said, "To provide culturally safe care in our circumstance, culturally safe biomedical services, we need to be humble enough to admit that we don't know everything about everyone's life experiences, culture, and feelings, and that the healthcare providers don't know it all. Cultural humility and cultural safety within the healthcare system requires health professionals to acknowledge that they're always on a journey of learning and being open to listening to what better care means for First Nations and Aboriginal peoples, and we all need to acknowledge it starts with me." So it's very challenging and difficult work, and it requires intention and dedication. But I was actually in a forum yesterday surrounding the topic, and I was reminded that as a non-Indigenous person, I have the privilege of choosing when I step into this work, whereas Indigenous peoples are living the harms every day. So they don't have that ability to step out of the reality of systemic racism. And so although this work is difficult, just for me, it just caused me to reflect on how difficult it is for Indigenous peoples. Adil, I see you off camera there. I'm just about to wrap up. A couple more slides. So what can you do to start on your own personal journey or further your personal journey? There's a ton of resources out there. On this slide, I'm sharing some resources that Sarah had helped put together for CMBEC 45. So As an example, reviewing the Territory Acknowledgement Booklet that's published by FNHA, or completing the CMBES Cultural Safety Training Program. In addition to the resources on the slide, some other ideas that came to mind were locating and reflecting on where you sit within the power wheel, reflecting and examining your mental models of Indigenous peoples, or taking an extra step to learn about the Indigenous communities in your local area. Final slide of recommendations. So for everybody on the call, I'd encourage you to think about what actions you might be able to take to help embed cultural humility and safety within your local organization. So again, it's going to look a bit different everywhere, but I think the learnings from this research can help inform a local plan. So for example, how might you support the key conditions for enabling cultural safety in your local context? So supporting cultural humility growth among your staff, building relationships, and ensuring that organizational supports are provided to do the work in a good way. For those of you that are in formal leadership positions, I think it's all of our responsibilities to be able to promote cultural humility and safety in our services, to be able to speak to its importance and why, and to be supportive of fostering those skills among our staff, and to be open and willing to engage in conversations surrounding cultural humility and safety. And again, it's an uncomfortable space for many of us, including myself, but I think we have a responsibility to do the work. Another recommendation is to ensure that culturally safe services are in place for existing Indigenous clients that you have. So can you take action to identify those existing clients, learn about their context in their community, develop those relationships, prioritizing connections, sustaining them, and then ultimately, most importantly, taking action to ask what culturally safe biomedical services look like to your Indigenous clients, and then aiming to deliver services in that way. Very lastly, recommend thinking about how you can build new relationships with Indigenous partners. So I'd caution against a cold calling approach where Indigenous communities are maybe identified and then biomedical services are offered, because that presumes that there's an issue to be solved, which very much might not be the case. So rather, I'd suggest being curious and exploring how Indigenous specific healthcare services are being delivered in the context of your areas, and then making connections and relationships within that space. And then I think through those connections and those relationships, the topic of biomedical equipment service may come up. And then just being curious and humble and respectful along the way, I think will help develop those new relationships. So I believe CMBS is going to share the actual research reports that I wrote up that goes into more detail around the various aspects of the research. But I hope that today that high-level overview was valuable for the audience, and I think we have some time for discussion and questions.
We definitely do. Thank you so much, Brendan. This was great. Just fantastic. Very eye-opening. I always find it's funny, right? I feel like this discussion in society, almost we have sort of our ups and downs on what's sort of the most important thing at the time of the day. And I feel like a couple of years ago, sort of everybody was almost, I would say, sort of talking about what we can do from an Indigenous and cultural recognition standpoint. But I find over the, as everything goes up, it sort of comes down. So it was sort of almost at a nice timing point just to remind ourselves sort of why we're here. So thank you for this. Let's get into some questions because I see there's some popping up. So there's one in the chat. So Brendan, could you kindly share some more specific examples of data that suggests that the BC healthcare system may provide lower quality standards to Indigenous individuals compared to the rest of the population?
Sure. Yeah, so I don't have that data readily available in front of me, but I'd suggest the best place to go would be to look at the in plain sight report that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. The report details with great specificity the difference in healthcare outcomes for Indigenous peoples within BC relative to the rest of the population. And so there's some pretty, at least for me, surprising and alarming information in there. And so that's the first reference that comes to mind.
Awesome. And Allison, I think maybe you put the document in the chat, so please take a look at that. Thank you. Martin is asking, how do you establish good working relationships with your FNHA clients?
It's a good question. So I think, Martin, that goes back to showing up in a humble way. If I think back to the start, at least in terms of my involvement with our journey and partnership with our FNHA colleagues, I remember the first couple of calls where I was, very early on in my cultural humility journey, and I was like super nervous to say the wrong thing. And I definitely said the wrong thing a number of times. I made mistakes. And I think the piece there was being humble enough to say, sorry, like I that wasn't my intention to, convey whatever it was in that way or to make that assumption. And just to be curious and say like, hey, I'm new to working in this space, and yeah, being open to correction and input. So I guess, Martin, I think it's that cultural humility piece, being humble, and I think for our Indigenous partners, they've given me at least a lot of grace, and I think that kind of mutual understanding and respect has led to what has developed to be a really great working relationship. But yeah, I think it comes back to showing up in a humble way.
Perfect. Brendan Nargis is asking, as a non-Indigenous visible minority and a third-year BMed student who grew up in a marginalized community, now recognizing my privilege, do you believe I and others in my position have a unique responsibility to support culturally safe biomedical services for Indigenous communities in our future careers?
Um, so I guess where my mind goes with that is I think when it comes to cultural humility and safety, it's a collective responsibility. So I think we all have a role to support that. Within the context of Canada, again, as I mentioned at the kind of outset of the presentation, reconciliation is an Indigenous specific goal. So we are working towards reconciliation for Indigenous peoples in Canada to acknowledge that terrible history that there is surrounding forced assimilation and genocide of Indigenous peoples within the country. But that doesn't also mean that there's other marginalized groups that exist. And so I think cultivating cultural humility skills will help with our interactions with Indigenous peoples, but it'll just help with interactions with any group, any marginalized group, and anyone that we're working with. So I think for us all, we have a responsibility to do that work and foster those skills as individuals and among our staff.
There's a anonymous attendee. They're asking, can you give examples what comments maybe I guess considered discriminatory in nature to Indigenous people? Some people may not realize certain comments are racist.
That's a tricky question. I guess maybe how I respond to that is I think comments that might have an underlying assumption about whoever the other person you're engaging with might be could be perceived as racist. I think I think the person on the receiving end would kind of need to provide that feedback if there's something that's expressed that's not that comes across as racist and isn't intended in that way. But I'm not sure if I'd be able to provide like specific examples of racist statements to avoid.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense for sure. This is, I guess, more of a comment, but maybe you can comment on this one. A vital factor we can work on is switch our mindset of the Indigenous people as partners rather than clients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great comment. I think throughout this presentation, I've been using the terminology as clients, but certainly I think partners recognizes that that autonomy piece and that co-creation of service delivery. So again, I think a partner does help emphasize that we are in this together. As the biomedical service provider, we are providing the service, but that doesn't mean that we need to define all aspects of how that service is provided. And it really is a partnership to explore what fits best and what works best in terms of Indigenous clients.
Perfect. There's one, we'll have one last question. I know we're up at the top of the hour, and sort of I'll take that honor to ask the last question, Brendan. You talked about reflexivity and your own personal biases, and I can imagine that's very difficult, right? You've obviously grown up in a certain way. You have all these over the years. How difficult did you find that, and how did you even know, that you are, something is being impacted by your own personal biases and views, and you really need to take a step back? Because I'm thinking about it, and like that's hard.
Yeah,
Right?
definitely. So I guess, it's kind of like thinking about your thinking. And so how did I do that? So I guess for me, I thought back, to my early childhood and where did my perspectives on Indigenous peoples come from? How were they informed? What were my experiences growing up? And I grew up in a small community in Southern Ontario, right on the edge of an Indigenous reserve. And I completed the SANYAS Cultural Safety and Humility course, which I mentioned in the presentation. And through that course, they encourage you to reflect on what those early experiences were that have helped inform perspectives today. And so I thought back to my childhood and all of these things, interactions that I saw that were very harmful that I hadn't thought about in my adult life. So I guess that's where I started. And it was very challenging because for myself, service some biases and assumptions that are not based in fact, and they were informed through those earlier childhood experiences. And so in the context of this research project, as I was going through and I was making interpretations, I would just stop to pause and actually doing some journaling to say, this is why I've made that interpretation, and challenge myself to think through different lenses to see, okay, is that actually an objective interpretation, or am I